Good afternoon. Let's start again. I'm sure the afternoon will spur some more interesting conversations. It's so great to have people in the room again. It's wonderful to have virtual because then people who couldn't otherwise be here are here, but it's great to be in the room and have these conversations. So the theme for this afternoon is the making, heart of making, meaning memory. And that whole first room in the exhibition is about making. To the left as you go in is about the learning, how to sew, and there's more samplers, as I say, in the cases in the study gallery to talk more about what schoolgirls were doing who had the ability to be sent to school to learn fancier work. And the rest of that room is about the making and mending and so on. And then just behind that wall of clothes, we have the sewing for as a profession. So we have the dress made by a dressmaker, the hat made by a milliner, and the coat made by a tailor. And as I mentioned before, other things made by mostly men in male-dominated professions, but they often hired women. So today we have Madeline Shaw here and later Kathy Staples to talk about different aspects of professional makers. Sewing was one of the skills taught to women of all who may not have had access to other education. And it was as a gender appropriate activity, it was one of the main things that they were allowed to do along with teaching. So many women made a living, often a pittance, out with their needles. And Madeline is here to talk about one aspect of that. Madeline Shaw is a curator and author specializing in the exploration of American culture and history and its international connections through textiles and dress. We know each other since graduate school at FIT, yay FIT, in New York City, just a few years ago. And we've been keeping up with each other and each other's work for a long time. She has held curatorial and administrative positions at the National Museum of American History, Smithsonian Institution, the Museum of Art at the Rhode Island School of Design, the New Bedford Whaling Museum, the Textile Museum here in Washington, and the museum at FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City. Her new book, make a note of this, titled Fleeced: Unraveling the History of Wool and War, with Australian co-author Trish Fitzsimmons, a wonderful woman and writer and researcher, will be published next year by Rowman and Littlefield Bloomsbury. So please welcome Madeline, who's going to talk about one group of these professional sewers. Thank you.
So I've been doing this for more than 40 years now, and I am always nervous until I start talking. I think I'd be over it by now, but no. Here we go. And I just want also to a brief shout out to Alden O'Brien, who is one of the best, smartest curators and object users and interpreters that I've ever had the privilege of knowing. So thank you. And I'm starting my timer now. And the thingy. This. Yeah. Okay. So, Whalers Women. Thanks again for that introduction, and also thanks to Sarah for putting all this together with Alden and giving me the opportunity to present this material to you. The port city of New Bedford, Massachusetts, owed much to the living its whalemen took from the sea, hunting for baleen, whalebone, and oil in coastal waters from the mid-1700s, and by the early 1800s, the region's ever-increasing number of whale ships set forth on years-long voyages that often took them around the world. Owners, captains, and sometimes mates of successful voyages made fortunes from this sea harvest. Others made their livings or fortunes through the numerous shoreside industries that outfitted the ships and their crews. The women of New Bedford and its surrounding communities were well acquainted with the realities of sewing work, paid and unpaid, that supported the whaling industry. So today we're going to look at two aspects of how New Bedford's women embraced what Alden called the all-consuming process of sewing as a means of emotional, financial, and social support during the 19th century heyday of the city's whaling industry. First, we'll look at what Joan Druitt called petticoat whalers and whaling wives, for whom needlework was a constant in their lives at sea. Second, at how the seemingly bottomless need for whalemen's clothing created opportunities for women to, well, if not earn an actual living, at least contribute to their own and their family's subsistence. Those of you in the back might want to scooch forward. I didn't realize how far away you would be from the thing. My interest in this topic began in 2007 when I worked at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, where I curated an exhibition examining the many ways in which the city's women and men engaged in sewing. It was called Needlework. Drawing on research by Joan Druitt and Lisa Norling, I searched for objects related to New Bedford's whaling wives, and I began what, because of the scale and timing of the exhibition, was a fairly cursory look at women outworkers. I've spent much more time recently with New Bedford sewing account books, mostly because I submitted an abstract for 20 minutes and they gave me an hour. This has generated a whole new set of questions regarding the two transitions from commission to ready-to-wear clothing and from outwork to factory work. It also has ramifications in regard to markets and trade partners. And on the whole, I also have to admit that this recent research has made me wish I had a much better relationship to spreadsheets. So first, we're going to talk about a brief introduction to pre-Civil War New Bedford. It was settled by Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard Quakers and Rhode Island Baptists and freethinkers. New Bedford was a relatively religiously tolerant community with deep abolitionist feelings. A boarding house sponsored by the Port Society for the sailors who made up a very significant portion of the transient population existed as early as 1800. And in its present location, together with a chapel called the Bethel, which figures largely in Moby Dick, in 1831. Many free and self-emancipated people of color lived in the area. Some were accorded a pretty high status in the community, such as shipowner and Captain Paul Cuffey on the left, and Polly Johnson, whose upscale confectionery provided sweets and ice cream for the town's most elite social events. Polly's husband, Nathan, however, was not accepted into the Quaker meeting, despite being recommended by his former employer, Charles W. Morgan. You may have visited the whale ship, the Charles W. Morgan in Mystic Seaport. In spite of the high degree of abolitionist support, and in fact, Frederick Douglass lived with the Johnsons in New Bedford when he first left his enslavement, and he got the name Frederick Douglass because Nathan was reading a book by Sir Walter Scott. There were still racial and class and economic divides and the geographic divides within New Bedford, but whaling really offered some colorblind opportunities, not least of which was the fact that if you were a runaway, you could hire yourself out to a whaling voyage and disappear essentially for 3 to 5 years, in which case maybe they would stop looking for you. In 1800, the town had 185 houses, which included those in Fairhaven across the bay, which only broke away in 1812. It had 2 meeting houses, one Quaker, one Congregationalist. By 1807, the harbor boasted 7 wharves, perhaps 100 ships, but only 12 of them were whale ships, dozens of smaller fishing and coastal trading vessels. In 1815, there were 500 houses in the town, and that now included just the eastern side of the bay, western side of the bay. Dozens of, it also had a notorious brothel, which I, up on the upper right, called for obvious reasons the Ark, which was a whale ship hulk. But in 1828, it caused a riot and was burned to the ground by the townfolk. By 1830, the city had 7,600 inhabitants, while 10,000 men worked in the whaling industry, which included sailors. Whaling dominated the harbor. In 1857, at whaling's peak, 329 whale ships called New Bedford home. Successful ventures made New Bedford prosperous. It funded schools, libraries, as well as railroads, banks, and textile manufacturing. Nevertheless, the 1849 Wamsutta cotton mill, which you see on the left of this painting, and the red engine of the New Bedford and Taunton train line, which is way in the background, which opened in about 1841, existed cheek by jowl with farmland and pastured sheep. Oh, so late. New Bedford's waterfront was cluttered with warehouses, whale oil refineries, outfitting establishments, ship chandlers and sail lofts, flop houses for sailors between voyages, ale houses, and all the other accoutrements of a bustling harbor. Numerous wharves teemed with ships and enormous numbers of men of many ages, races, languages, and levels of skill and experience, or none at all, seeking positions. This did include, as I've said, the self-emancipated men. This New Bedford was a haven, really, for a lot of them. But it also included a lot of men from South Sea Islands and from many of the islands and ports that whale ships stopped at for watering. Melville really had it right. The composition of a whaling ship's crew was very cosmopolitan. Generally, a crew was about 30 men. They manned and maintained the sails, the ships, and the whaleboats. They did all the various jobs involved with cutting in a whale to retrieve the oil and baleen. The fancy shirts that you see on the right there, they were called shore shirts, and the sailors often sewed and or ornamented them themselves during their long months at sea. And it's important to keep in mind that sewing in an ocean-going community was not a skill restricted to women. These are plaques for deceased seamen in the whalemen, in the sailors' Bethel. And you can see that whalemen faced many and varied dangers. Disease, drowning, accident, storms, and predators, human and other. Whether their women sailed with them or were left behind for several months in the early voyages to 3 or 5 years, or 3 years by the 1830s, and as whales grew scarcer, 5 years by the 1860s. They had plenty to worry about besides their menfolk, namely their own circumstances and the need to care for themselves and their families, literally, until their ship came in. Druitt and Norling quoted a number of women's diaries and letters in their books, not all of them from New Bedford, but almost all of them mentioned sewing. One woman's story spanned both sides of this talk. Azuba Bierce of Nantucket, as a 15-year-old seamstress in 1835, slipped a note reading, quote, "I hope I meet the dashing young man I made these clothes for," end quote. She slipped that into the pocket of a suit she worked on. 19-year-old William Cash found the note. They married in 1839, and she went to sea with him in 1850. Yeah, aw. Just wait. Aw. See those 3 little red rooms? Yeah, that's where she lived. So only captains could take their wives to sea. Children occasionally accompanied their parents, and women often gave birth during their 3 to 5 year voyages, usually having been sent ashore at some point to await their delivery. Life on board was often dull, weeks, months, and years at sea, punctuated by frantic and dangerous whale hunts and short port visits to resupply the ship with water and foodstuffs, make repairs, and leave, if you were lucky, barrels of oil for transshipping home. The captain and family might have had 2 private rooms, and they've got letters here in red. The after cabin or sitting room is location B above, about 6 feet by 8 feet. Not room to swing a cat. And a bedroom, location C, about 6 by 10. There was another 8 by 10 foot cabin marked A, where the officers and captain and family dined. And that was a kind of adjunct sitting room for the other officers. Some captains had a small shelter built on deck for their wives to use for reading or sewing, or just getting some fresh air. Fresh is, when there's a lot of whaling going on, is a relative term. So our first New Bedford whaling wife is Annie Holmes. She was born in 1841. She married at age 16 to Daniel, one of New Bedford's many, many Ricketsons. Her first child, born in 1867, died at birth. In May 1871, pregnant again, Annie joined Daniel, now captain of the whale ship A.R. Tucker, on a voyage to the Indian Ocean and South Atlantic that would last more than 3 years. Her baby was born in their first port, Fayal, in the Azores. Tragically, died 2 days later. She was buried on the island, joined within a month by another baby girl, born to another captain's wife. The ship then rounded the Cape of Good Hope, sailed to Australia, cruised for 2 years in the Malacca Straits, and stopping at various islands and in that region, in the Indian Ocean, and also Singapore. Then spent 4 months in the mid-Atlantic on the way home, bringing back a full cargo of whale oil. We know from later journals that Annie stitched a Job's Trouble quilt in 1881 aboard another ship. Her husband died on that voyage. Annie returned home, is said to have remarried twice, but her later life is still a mystery. The Tucker Journal, however, is rife with needlework. From June through November 1871, she cut out 2 pair of white duck pants, probably for Daniel, sewed a dress while Daniel stitched a sail, sewed a thin dress for going ashore, made bow ties for Daniel to wear ashore, and embroidered a chair seat. She didn't have much else to do. In January 1872, she had a chair and pillows fixed up in the bed so she could sit up and sew in rough weather. Now, I wish she'd drawn a picture of how that worked, because if you look at the middle picture here, which is the captain's quarters on the Morgan and Mystic, and the bed is in the back, I don't know how they fit a chair in there. In 1872, she made Daniel a watch case and a flag with Masonic designs, and mentioned embroidering and putting on braid, but had no details. In harbor near Malacca, she was cutting out clothing to stitch when she had to stop for a visit from, quote, one of the kings and his wife, end quote, and also visited the captain's wife on another ship for a special reason. Mrs. Brown, well, quote, Mrs. Brown tucking me a skirt on the sewing machine, and I working of a pattern of a butterfly on a tidy. It was very amusing to see the natives stare at the sewing machine and shake their heads at it, end quote. The next day, she recorded, quote, this morning finished my butterfly, and Captain Brown finished off my skirt. He sews on the sewing machine more than she does, end quote. Annie's social life was limited to such visits in port, or to ships visiting in passing on the sea, which would sometimes heave to for what was called a gam, exchanging news, perhaps if they were working for the same whaling agent and they knew one had left port after another, they might meet up in the sea somewhere and they would exchange letters and newspapers and things like that, food and other goods. Annie would have been transported by means of a gamming chair, which she would get into. They would lower it to a whaleboat that then rode to the other ship from whence she would be lifted out. Fun times. And is that big enough to read? I'm sorry. I meant to say, you can read here, but maybe you can't. A sampling of her work over the remainder of the voyage. Her needle skills included making things for herself, for her husband, and for the ship. I think she was an active and important aid to her husband on board. And I think that that was important. That kind of experience was something that most whaling wives did actually have on their voyages. She facilitated social exchanges in addition to the needlework and the physical work, but she facilitated social exchanges both in port and at sea that might aid her husband in moving up the ladder to agent or to someone with more authority and power. The Whaling Museum holds objects made by some of these women. Bethia, whose wife, the wife of Reuben F. Hart, who was the master of the schooner R.F. Hart, his own name, which made only Atlantic voyages, made the hooked rug at Left, whose red sections came from a flannel petticoat stolen off a clothesline in the Azores by one of her crewmen who knew she was looking for red wool. Bethia was born in Maine in 1839. She married Captain Hart sometime after her first husband died, very early in the Civil War. And she wrote articles for local newspapers on his work transporting supplies in the coastal trade during the war. And the couple even met Abraham Lincoln when their ship docked at City Point here in DC. After the war, Bethia accompanied Reuben to sea. She acquired excellent sailing skills herself. Reuben died in 1887, Bethia in 1940, aged 101. At Wright, Elizabeth Marble and her handiwork, some of her handiwork. She was born in 1825. She sailed with her husband, Captain John Marble, who was born in 1813, on two voyages, the Kathleen, 1857 to 60, and the Awashonks, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, 1860 to 62. They sailed out of New Bedford. She had lost her first child while John was at sea on an earlier voyage. They took their son George, born in 1850, along on these voyages. The frames for the chair, footstool, and a second footstool were carved by Captain Charles Perry Worth of the New Bedford Bark Draco. He had been sailing from 1854. They met up in Australia, in Fremantle. He was on his way home. They were on their way to start their whaling adventure. He handed them what he had spent the last 3 years carving, and they spent the next 3 years embroidering and upholstering. So she also stitched quite a lot of clothing. John died of dysentery on their second voyage in 1861. And Elizabeth and George survived the same illness. They brought his body back in an oil cask for burial in New Bedford. On the right, Phoebe Derrickson Cherry was born in 1834. She was the wife of Captain John Cherry, a master mariner from Fairhaven, and she's there with her daughter Abby, who was born in May 1862. On the Cherry's 1857 to 1861 voyage in the Pacific whaling grounds on the Bark Harvest, it's noted in another whaling wife's diary that in January 1859, Mrs. Cherry had been spending 10 months living in Manganui, New Zealand, with the wife of the harbor master and had given birth to a fine son. She must have gotten pregnant again almost as soon as she reboarded the Harvest, for the ship's logbook records on November 11, 1860, that Captain Cherry's son died, and on December 5th, that his youngest and now only child, a daughter, also died. Abby was born in May 1862. She died in September 1865, while the family was at sea on yet another voyage. She's buried in Hawaii. Child mortality was, of course, a fact of life in 19th century. But for whaling families, there was almost always an added grief in that you buried your child in a place you might never see again. And the baby clothes and other garments that were kept by Phoebe were keepsakes that I think spoke both to work accomplished, but to unimaginable and almost unspeakable grief. And finally, Myra hires carpet, made in a multi-cross stitch, aptly, given the circumstances, called Leviathan stitch. During the first voyage of the New Bedford bark Wanderer from 1878 to 81, Myra, who was the captain's wife, of course, spent a good deal of time engaged in sewing, and she taught her husband Andrew to sew too. In 1881, Myra was sent ashore with the carpet on St. Helena to await her first child. When the Wanderer and Andrew returned, he found that she had died in childbirth. The carpet's central field, therefore, remained unfinished. He left the ship to care for his daughter and returned to New Bedford with her when she was 8 months old. St. Helena, like the Azores, the Canaries, and Cape Verde Islands, was a common watering and social stop for whaling voyages. The Hyers probably had a sewing machine on the Wanderer. There's a collection of 12 letters written by the couple on the voyage, posted in Australia and St. Helena, that refer to making shirts, skirts, and petticoats. One unbelievably complicated petticoat with a ruffle at the hem, 2 sets of several narrow tucks with a big wide tuck in between them. Perfect straight seams for a sewing machine. Captain Hire wrote proudly of the garments that he and his wife collaborated on making, including clothes for the baby of another captain's wife. But sadly, he would die a pauper in a Staten Island mariner's home. The Whaling Museum has a wealth of portraits of local women, not all identified, and none identified as seamstresses in the local trades. The picture at left has been tentatively identified as Maria Beckley Fleetwood, with her children, Annie and Solomon. Her husband, Lewis, had after serving as a waiter on a coastal steamer, decided in 1853 to become an ocean-going seaman. His career at sea, however, was short-lived. Maria, in the 1859 city directory, is listed as a widow, and her name has not cropped up. Widows often took in stitching work. Her name has not cropped up in the work so far. On the right, 2 of the women in this portrait were named by the donor of the image. The names, unfortunately, don't match up with either known whaling wives or with any of the seamstresses. Nor, to my disappointment, did they match up with any of the lady managers of the ladies' branch of the New Bedford Port Society, which operated the Bethel and the Mariners' Home, because in 1837, the ladies opened a clothing store for seamen at the Bethel, proposing to offer goods at fair prices, well made by whalemen's virtuous and needy womenfolk. The New Bedford city directories give us a partial picture of the city's needle trades. The 1836 edition, for example, listed 9 milliners, 10 tailors, 6 dress or mantua makers, 6 merchant tailors, and 3 tailoresses. The 1865 directory lists 17 merchant tailors and 12 each of tailors, dressmakers, and milliners. No tailoresses, no seamstresses. It also includes listings for a secondhand clothing dealer and 3 clothing stores. Shirts. New Bedford had many sewing opportunities for women who did not go to sea. Those who were educated or skilled enough to open a milliner's, mantua, or dressmaking shop, or a small retail shop, or a school, were socially and economically a cut above the average seamstress. Newspaper ads and city directories give us only some of their names, however. The Whaling Museum owns an account book from a Fairhaven shop run by Sarah Hathaway, dating to 1815 to 18. Sarah had taken over the shop a few years earlier from her mother, who opened it after her husband, Captain Elkanah Hathaway, died at sea in 1796. Sarah's two brothers-in-law and her younger brother also died at sea, so she may also have been supporting her sisters and their children, as well as her mother and herself, from the proceeds of the shop. The business was complex. Her customers only very occasionally paid in cash. Otherwise, they paid in things like yarn and cloth, or services like weaving the yarn that she would give to them or put out to them. We only have that little tiny bit of information about her, and there's just not enough to flesh out any kind of business biography on her, unless somebody is, really willing to, like, I don't know how you would find it, but somebody should try. Through the 1820s, many dry goods merchants in New Bedford offered tailoring services in the shop, either on their own or by hiring an artisan to do the cutting out and then local women to do the making up. Shops specifically listed as tailors and later merchant tailors abounded in New Bedford. Some offered both custom and ready-mades, and others catered only to the upper level of society, specializing in custom-made clothing. In 1836, two help-wanted tailoress ads appeared in the New Bedford Mercury. Thomas H. Brown, a dry goods merchant who either employed or was partners with Oliver H. P. Brown, a tailor at the same business address, was looking for 3 or 4 tailoresses. James S. Barney, a tailor who was at 39 North Water Street, also the address of one of the city's major outfitters, Cook and Snow, wanted 6 or 8. In the 1859 directory, Oliver H. P. Brown and Company was listed as a merchant tailor. The & Co. was listed as W. H. Wrightington, who had been a clerk at Thomas Brown's. New Bedford is so incestuous, you cannot believe it. I do not know if she was related to Eliza Wrightington, because they all have the same names. By the 1830s, more and more of these businesses involved the production and sale of sailors' slops. The Shark Store of the song lyric, which is up there, it was where the unwitting novice whaleman was separated from much of his not yet earned income by the practice of outfitting him for the voyage against his lay or share of the voyage's profits. During the voyage, the sailor whose clothing wore out either had to buy clothing or fabric from the slop chest, which was owned by the whaling agent and the captain, and they split the proceeds 50-50, or they waited until the ship made port somewhere and they tried to find better clothing there. Many tailors and merchants who made and or sold slops also invested in whaling voyages and whale ships, eventually amassing capital beyond what would have been expected in a simple tailoring establishment. The New Bedford City Directory contained many similar ads. The ones in the previous slide were from the whaleman shipping list. Here are a few from the 1849 edition of the City Directory, and I want to point out William Bradford at Wright, who, in spite of being the first New Bedford tailor to operate a sewing machine, shortly afterwards left the demanding tailoring business for the easier life of an artist, at which he proved much more successful. J and W.R. Wing were one of New Bedford's largest and longest-lived tailoring outfitting firms. Very shortly after they opened, became a whaling agent and investor, and they operated between 1849 and 1917. Relevant company records, including sewing accounts, are in the New Bedford Free Public Library, but are currently inaccessible due to condition. The Whaling Museum, which holds business records for 23 wing whaling voyages, some of which information may overlap with the other records, also has a microfilm copy of some of the library's papers, which is not in great condition either. But my intern reviewed that for me back in 2007 for the exhibition. And I have several women who regularly worked for Wing, but I have not been able to get back into that microfilm to learn more about them. The list illustrates one of the great frustrations about researching these women seamstresses. Of the 11 names that are listed here, we found only 2 that we could identify pretty clearly in the city directories or vital records, the city's vital records. Census records have their own difficulties, mainly the agonizingly common repetition of first and last names, especially when you factor in marriages. None of these names show up in the surviving records from the 3 other New Bedford outfitters, T and JP Knowles, Charles Ricketson and Son, and Cook and Snow. In fact, none of the more than 120 seamstresses are overall, but some 35 of which I have both first and last names, overlap at all. And the names from the 1838 sewing account book from brothers Thomas and John Pepper Knowles are, they were tailors in successive stores on Union Street from 1832. They quickly added dry goods and groceries, and for 50 years from 1844, they were whaling agents and outfitters and retail shopkeepers. In 1836, 26 women did outwork stitching for Knowles. Most exchanged their labor for short store credit for goods, groceries, cloth, shoes, stockings, yarn, tobacco, rum, ribbon, and needles. I had hoped that Mrs. Haskins, who's at the top of the list there on the left, might be the wife of Amos Haskins, as a member of the Wampanoag tribe, who after years of serving as a seaman and mate on New Bedford whale ships, eventually captained one, but the dates unfortunately did not align. Curses. And also there are 4 other male Haskins listed in the New Bedford City directory for 1836. Thank you so much. Captain Amos, by the way, died at sea. Eliza Wrightington, another name that's on that list, is John Marble's wife's name, but she was only 13 in 1838. You give up. Hence the spreadsheets. The going rate was 75 cents to make a jacket, 20 to 25 cents to make trousers or pants, 12 to 15 cents for a shirt. Some workers who were perhaps more experienced earned a few cents more per garment, but mostly they were around the same kind of value. This is Mrs. Tabor's account underneath an abbreviated account for Eliza Wrightington. Mrs. Tabor exchanged her labor, mostly on jackets and monkey jackets, some of the higher paying garments, for butter, oil, lard, flour, buttons, cloth, and molasses. She earned $12.27 and she received $9.56 worth of goods. The balance owed her was carried forward to the next period. Mrs. Carr stitched shirts, pants, jackets, frocks, and bed ticks, 80 in total, from November 1837 through mid-February 1838. She earned $15.36. She exchanged her labor for sugar, butter, flour, coffee, oil, ginger, and saleratus, which I had to look up, and is baking soda. Her earnings balance was also carried over. Mrs. Gordon, from July 5th through September 11th, paid 11 visits to the shop. She made 33 separate items, mostly jackets and pants, but 6 shirts, and near the top for altering 6 jackets. She earned $9.33 worth of store credit. She used it for some textiles, but mostly for staples such as molasses, sugar, tea, and oil, all balancing out to the penny. The second group of accounts come from Charles Ricketson and Son tailors. Customers included individual townsmen and seamen, ship's captains who were buying for themselves, for the slop chest, or for the trade goods, and whaling agents and ship owners who were buying for the slop chests of 1 or more ships. On average, they employed about 20 women at a time, as well as several men. Ricketson's accounts run from 1834 to 44, and since the company didn't sell groceries, The women exchanged their labor either for fabric, thread, and oddly, shoes, or were paid in cash, or, which I found most interesting, by bill to order on another shop. In addition to sales of clothing and provisions to individual sailors, including shirts to individual customers for 90 cents to $1 each, Ricketson sold vast amounts of ready-made clothes to whaling ship captains or owners. In July 1835, Rachel Robbins earned $16.37 for sewing, all by hand, 57 shirts, 30 frocks, and 15 pairs of drawers for a total of 102 garments. In comparison, the month before, Ricketson sold 18 duck frocks, 100 duck trousers, and 50 striped cotton shirts, 168 garments, to the ship John Adams, charging the owners $339.71. It seems safe to say that the profits on the clothing were not going to the seamstresses. And they, even factoring in the cost of overhead and cloth and thread and cutting out the garments, the profits were huge. Okay. From November 1835 through April 1836, Ricketson paid 20 women, some more than once, for a total of 26 payments, mostly for outwork. Some of the women were paid for making some number of itemized garments, like Judith Ricketson, who in September 1834 earned $25.33 for making 152 shirts, which comes out, by the way, to 16.66666 onward cents per shirt, which was actually well above the average. The same month and year, Esther Baxter purchased some fabric and a thimble by making 8 shirts and 6 frocks. Others were paid just by a bill of work or to cash, like Carolyn Dyer, which is the bottom of the left slide, who was no itemization. And fairly often, a woman is paid not in cash, but as Sarah Wood was in June of 1834, for $3.67 by a bill to order on another firm, in this case, Tabor Shearman. Tabor Shearman was a New Bedford grocer, and of course, a whaling agent. There are a number of such payments throughout the book by bill on and to order on. This suggests that Ricketson and other New Bedford merchants had a reciprocal bills method of paying their employees. I have not yet gotten into the Tabor records that do exist at the Whaling Museum to see if there's more information from that end. Women who had sewing earnings from Ricketson might not receive either goods or cash themselves. Several women's accounts were paid to their husbands, including in 1834 to 35, Job Allen's receipt of $4.17 for his wife's making 25 shirts, and later paying for goods from the shop with $1.41 in cash and the rest by his wife making 25 shirts. Poor thing. In February 1836, a new notation appears. A number of women's names appear in what seems to be a year-end accounting for work they did in the shop from February 1835 to February 1836. 6 women were paid in cash for work in the shop. 2 worked 9 weeks and 3 days. 2 worked 47 weeks, 1 at 37 weeks, and 1 at 51 weeks. 9 others were paid by bill of work, not noted as being in the shop. In 1843, 8 women worked in the shop for between 12 and 51 weeks. 12 others worked at home and were paid in cash, goods from the shop, or to order on another shop again. 10 years later, many of the same women are still sewing for the Ricketsons on the same terms. Let's see, I have asterisks I think, and some, I'm trying to keep track of who might appear in what directory and things. And like I said, I'm spreadsheet deficient. So some of the names indicate that a tailor of that same last name was active in New Bedford. So I had another avenue to explore. Are they related to a tailor? But what I don't know about the Ricketson women is whether piecework or a weekly wage was more profitable for them. It's hard to say how long it took to stitch a shirt and earn 12 cents, as opposed to working a week for $2.75. The $2.75 a week, which is a 6-day week, comes out to 45.8 cents a day. So can you sew 4 shirts in a day? Hi. But you know, who knows? Maybe you didn't take very small stitches. And how long a day? So if probably a 10-hour day. In the New Bedford Mercury of October 11th, 1839, Thomas Cook, born in 1801, died about 1891, and Loom Snow, under the name of Cook and Snow, merchant tailors and dry goods merchants, advertised for tailoresses wanted. The subscribers are in want of 6 good hands. Liberal wages will be given and pay in cash every Saturday night, end quote. This obviously sounds like in-house work and a 6-day week. The shop was at 39 Water Street, on the opposite side of the street from the buildings you see here on the left, and at the far end of the street. It would have looked much the same, but the block on the other opposite side has been subsumed by the Whaling Museum and no longer looks like that at all. The firm also acted as an agent for many whaling vessels. By 1859, Snow had left the firm to become a whaling agent on his own. 2 account books, which appear to be from the company, although one is not labeled as such, are held at the New Bedford Free Public Library, and I only just found these this summer. The clothing book runs from 1854 through the 1860s, and I managed to get halfway through it, up to page 163, in case anybody wants to go. 96 women's names are in the book. Most of them many more times than once, as the accounts were kept by the year and brought over from the day book. This page lists not women's names, but the type of garments they stitched and the total cost for making, including fabric, buttons, and thread, along with the cost of labor. On the left-hand page in the left margin, however, is the name of the woman who stitched the garments listed in that little section, along with the amount of her bill. This is not always the case. Unfortunately, the right-hand page doesn't list a maker for the 128 red flannel shirts and 104 pairs of huck trousers and 198 frocking shirts. The quantities are amazing. It's possible that this page records the work of tailoresses who worked in the shop as opposed to those who were doing outwork. So, or perhaps the 1836 advertisement wasn't geared to in-house workers. So there's a lot more detective work that needs to be done on this particular firm to find out how they worked, how they operated. Now, speaking of impossible for you to read, this is a page from the microfilmed census records for New Bedford that I was looking through to try and find and track down some of these girls and women. Figure out more about the names in the account books. This was a particularly interesting page, though, because I was looking for Joshua Winslow. Yes, I know, 45 minutes. Okay, shut up. Because I was looking for Joshua Winslow, who was a master mariner. And he also appears in the Cook and Snow account books as picking up stuff to take away for sale or for sewing. So I what, right? So I found him in the census records, and lo and behold, it turns out that several of his neighbors are possible Cook and Snow seamstresses. the names line up. That was sort of a hallelujah moment and also a, oh dear God moment, because now I had to find if any of those names appear in any other census records, which of course they do. So the birthplace here is listed in the second long column. The first long column or wide column is the name. Second is, wide column is the birthplace, and then the third one is their employment, their occupation. So he's there, Joshua Winslow, Joshua Dartmouth, merchant, mariner. And but Winslow neighbors who also appear in the Cook and Snow account books include Rebecca Hart, who's just below, the Winslow clan, Sarah Jennings, who in 1865 was 39 and married to a cooper, Mary Gifford, Anne Fish, plus men of the Russell, Hathaway, Maxfield, Macomber, and Mosher families. A Mary Macomber is listed in the Cook and Snow account, but she's not one of the Winslow neighbors. So I think this just needs a map, putting people down on where they were born or where they lived at particular times and what they were near in terms of the firms that they might have been working in. So I checked online and state federal census records for many of the seamstresses' names. Of the few that I felt I could attach a likely human being to, even fewer were married to or children of mariners or those in the whaling industry. I thought that was really interesting. Sewing for the ready-made clothing industry encompassed much more female labor than just the wives and daughters of the mariners. These Cook and Snow account pages for Ruby Maker and Rebecca Skiff give you detail on the quantities of garments women were stitching and the time frames they worked in. And they are among the women I was able to trace. Ruby Peckham managed George W. Maker in October 1821. In the 1850 census, she's listed as 45 years old, making her age at marriage about 16. She was widowed by 1849. Her husband left a complicated will that allowed her lifetime rights in their homestead in the woods at their farm, plus all their household goods. 2 trustees were appointed to turn the rest of his real estate into cash and invest it to support her children until the youngest was no longer at home, at which point it was to be distributed among them. They had 7 children living when he made his will, which he apparently made knowing he was ill. And I think there might be quite a tale of trustees not being overly generous with their support of her and her children to make her take in sewing. Rebecca Skiff was born in about 1818, married about 1832 to Pardon T. Skiff, a laborer who in the 1852 city directory is listed as a cab driver, who died of consumption in 1859. They had 5 children. The eldest may have been the reason they married when she was at best 15. In the 1870 census, she's listed as a laborer, and her youngest child, Aaron, then 20, is apprenticed to a tinsmith. I'm pretty sure she needed all the money she could make sewing. And I traced 2 other women. Lydia Teachout, born about 1829, was married to John, a blacksmith, in 1846. By 1860, she had 5 living children, aged 7 to 13. In the 1900 census, she's living with a son, reported having had 10 children, 6 living. I couldn't find when John died, but realistically, with 5 small children in the 1850s, it's not unlikely that she took in sewing work to help make ends meet. Lydia Ricketson may be the daughter of Henry, a tailor on his own, not a member of the Charles Ricketson Company, but almost certainly was related. Aged 26 in 1851, she married George Wadey, a trader or merchant. In 1903, she made a will leaving her shares of the Pullman Company, AT&T, and the New Bedford Merchants Bank, and gas electric companies, and her shares of her father's estate to her sister and other relatives. Apparently, she had no children. Maybe she picked up sewing from loom and snow to be done, or cook and snow to be done at her father's shop, or maybe she helped out there. Lydia is also the only one of the named seamstresses that cross-references with the Whaling Museum's collection of samplers, the one at Wright, made in 1835, when Lydia would have been about 10. Mind you, I'm not totally sure she's the right Lydia Ricketson, as there are a couple of other possibilities, but I really want it to be her. So, in conclusion, Whalers' womenfolk faced hardships and challenges, whether on land or at sea. Needlework was both a limiting and a liberating factor in their lives as they strove to earn a living and or craft a life. Druitt and Norling have brought keen insight into the lives and motivations of the whaling wives and of mariners' wives, and why they chose to go to sea rather than wait at home, or how they managed alone for years on end with their families, their finances, and their homes, or lack thereof, on their own, as best they could. But there's another side to the New Bedford story. What do we know and what don't we know about the women who stitched the hundreds of thousands of items that supported New Bedford's whaling industry? We know that work in the shop and outwork coexisted at least as early as the mid-1830s. We know that for the most of the women we can identify with some degree of certainty, their menfolk's occupations included farming, clerking, laboring, skilled crafts supporting both land and sea necessities, as well as shipping out to sea. By and large, what they earned sewing was at best a subsistence wage. What don't we know? Say of the 350 or so whale ships registered in New Bedford in 1858, that 100 or so left port in any given year. If crew numbers averaged about 30, that gives a minimum of 3,000 sailors needing outfits. Add in the numbers of garments sold to the slop chests, which included both items to be sold to the crew and items for trade or sale in various ports, for which, as I said, the captain and whaling agent generally split the profits. Can the output of the shops that we have accounts for be calculated to determine what the average output of New Bedford might have been and how many seamstresses it might have taken to produce them? We don't know whether all of this production was being consumed in the New Bedford region or even in Bristol County or even Massachusetts. Was there a larger market beyond the trading carried on during voyages by the captains? Boston was nearby, and while it was not a whaling port, it was a coastal and transatlantic sailing hub. The newspapers abound with seamen's slop clothing dealers and merchant tailors, all kinds of seamen's clothing, cheap for cash, one ad read. Boston's Oak Hall Merchant Tailoring House had its own on-site workrooms from very early. So was Boston also a hotbed of female labor for women's clothing or seamen's clothing? Or might some of this be the output of canny New Bedford businessmen who, with good stage and later ferry and train connections to Boston and capital to invest, and I'm sorry, again, the names that are highlighted with the red arrows are the names of merchant tailors and tailors in New Bedford who were also investing in insurance for the whaling industry. They had capital. So might they be sending goods to Boston and beyond to absorb their excess output? Was some of it going south to clothe enslaved people down in the Caribbean or in South America or in the southern states? Was New Bedford typical of port cities in its ready-made clothing businesses, smaller, bigger? And finally, what does this contribute to our overall picture of the transition from outwork to factory work? Can more of the women be traced, as well as the men whose names appear in the books, either as picking up work for their wives or in doing jobs such as cutting out? Placing these, along with the businesses on a map of the region, would be really helpful in understanding how the labor market divvied itself up. Can the business records of those that bought clothing from the tailoring firms flesh out more of the story? Were women grateful to be able to stitch endless long seams on a machine rather than by hand? Happy to get out of the house and not have to fit their stitching into a day already filled with household chores and child rearing? How did earnings compare? All of these questions point to why I need to turn this over to a spreadsheet whiz who can sort all of this data from the records into some kind of cumulative totals. And I mean that. I can't do this work. I want somebody to come up and say, I'll take it. And New Bedford has this phenomenal record of historic preservation. It provides numerous opportunities for research. The library, the Whaling Museum, the New Bedford Historical Society, and I think on its own and in comparison to other port cities, It's a really great opportunity. I'd be happy to help open doors in that city for anyone interested. Thank you. People so rarely say that about me. Swag, we love swag.
So we're gonna take a quick 15-minute break. So at 2:15, we're gonna start again. And earlier I said during the 3 o'clock break, what I meant was the 2 o'clock break. So this is your chance to put in your raffle tickets. Again, they have no value after 2:15. So if you wanna win it, go stuff it, just make sure it has your name on it. See you back at 2:15.